You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Welcome to 2025. Welcome to the 47th Presidency of the United States. I have the honor of saying that this podcast has been on long enough that I've been through 5 presidencies: Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, and Trump again. We count presidencies in history according to the length of service, not the person. So Grover Cleveland is the 22nd and the 24th. That way the order's clear that you know that there's a president in between. So this is a separate presidency. More important than just having the honor over 19 years, it'll be 19 in July, of covering the 5 presidencies is, more importantly, we've looked at 46 of them. And I think we can start to apply that to what's going on in the 47th. As wild a ride as I expect it will be. History does speak to current events, even when you have an actor that might be doing a lot of things at once, or might be acting in a different way from, say, norms. I still think history's useful. And the thing we've always said, even as early as 2006 and 2007, when I started this podcast, is that, we're looking at history. We're not saying that things can never be different, or that somebody can't, especially having examined how it went in the past, say, well, I don't want to do what those other people did. I want to do something differently. Guess what? They're still, in their own way, using history as a guide. And that's the same as we'll do our best job here of doing. There's no reason to throw out the history books, folks, I guess is my main point. For example, what you're seeing is a lot of activity at the beginning, a lot of activity, a lot of executive orders, a lot of actions on immigration. And I guess so that I properly sandwich this episode to be objective enough, I'll say that's what you should be doing in a presidency. I mean, that's pretty clear to me, having examined presidents. Should be an office of action. The convention, they called for an executive with energy and dispatch. Even though we have older presidents recently, the convention set the age lower than there's ever been a president. They anticipated that there could be a 36-year-old president. We never did get William Jennings Bryan in 1896 there, who would have just made that. They anticipated that there could have been a young, very young president. And look, I mean, that's what they were looking for. Not somebody to do nothing, not somebody to be lethargic. There's a line in there about shall faithfully execute the laws. You're not supposed to be passive. Now, the first occupant of the office, I think, also demonstrated that there's wisdoms in sometimes doing nothing, and sometimes deferring to Congress and all of those things. So a strong tradition comes from that end too, because everything Washington did influenced what came thereafter. But there's nothing in the rule book, and as I look at history over the broad swath, there's nothing that says you're supposed to be like a passive person in the White House. It's supposed to be active. And the more active you are, the better. And here's going to be the hard part for people that don't agree with what's going on. American voters have shown a propensity to sometimes re-elect a person or the party in the White House that takes a lot of actions, that gets a lot of bills passed, that does a lot on the foreign policy stage, even though when you quiz them, when you take opinion polls, the numbers of support for some of those policies may not be that high. They look at driving the car versus the direction of the car as a way to look at it. So the only thing I could say to those who are Democrats is you look at this, the way this presidency is starting, and, you look at it for the future. That's what you should be seeing the president doing, a lot of activities in the beginning. And also, this is the modern era, but successful presidents always have found a way to also communicate those activities. We're going to talk about in a future episode about presidential aides. That's becoming important right now. President's bringing all sorts of people in to help them in official and unofficial roles. But some of these guys, what they'll do, they might be secretary to the president. There's a fellow named Loeb that helps out TR a lot. But he's also working with the press, massaging reporters, and sort of giving them stories to report on. So they don't report on the bad stuff about the boss. So it's this combo of activity and communications of that activity that have become so important for the last 46 presidencies. I think having said all that, that's a great time to take an issue with one of these executive orders, and that's the one on birthright citizenship, and talk about a decision in the past, and talk about the 14th Amendment and all the reasons why I think it's probably ill-considered. So in 1895, Wong Kim Ark gets on a boat from China for the United States, and he arrives at the port only to find that he's detained. A new law has been passed, the Chinese Exclusion Act, specifically limiting Chinese population that can be in the United States. I would say largely moderns would view this as a racist law. There's no doubt about that. It's done because, well, in California in particular, but also in other areas of the country, but a particular movement in California starts. It's called the Sandlot Movement. And the Sandlot Movement, there's an empty sandlot next to the City Hall in San Francisco. People meet, and they're workers, and some of them were out of work at different economic times. They blame the railroads for hiring large amounts of Chinese people, and they want new immigration laws. You saw with Sandlot even the same type of debate you see today with immigration, where it's like, well, why don't you go after the companies? The Sandlotters did. They aimed their ire really at the railroad, Stanford University. So Stanford, for instance, that was someone that they aimed their ire at, the owner of the big railroads that were employing Chinese immigrants over them. Of course, there's also really the economy that's in fault, them not being unemployed, but you know how things go. But the more nuanced of them would be generous enough to say, we're not blaming the people, and eventually they're influential with the legislature, and they get these laws. Not only do they get them passed, but it's also taken up by James Blaine, a politician and someone known for finding that kind of like whatever's the issue I can attach myself to. And this is passed. Well, all of this happens where Mr. Ark has arrived. Here's the issue. He had been born in the United States. He was born in 1873 on Sacramento Street in San Francisco. His parents were from China, so you'd say they were subjects of the Emperor of China at that time. But they lived in the United States for quite a time, and they had a domicile there. Wong Kim Ark was just visiting China in 1890, and he comes back in 1895. It was meant to be a temporary stay. He's a laborer. He doesn't have any other particular skill, because the new law would allow some exceptions if you're from a particular class. He's a laborer. That's not covered. And so he's detained. A first court says he's a citizen. He was born here. He's a natural-born citizen. He has his rights. And the Solicitor General of the United States, following the Chinese exclusion law, brings the issue to the Supreme Court. We can get into all the various arguments. It is a Supreme Court case that has two dissents, including the Chief Justice and including a famous dissenter, John Harlan, who is celebrated for his decision on Plessy, his dissent on Plessy versus Ferguson, the case about separate but equal. But the majority of the court, the rest of the court, and really for decades afterwards, from 1899 forwards, including a decision just as 1982, when someone would dare even challenge Wong Kim Ark's couple of cases in the 90s and the like, that you have citizenship conferred by where you were born. So Wong Kim Ark comes back to the United States in 1894 after a visit in China of 1 year. He brings with him the things that at that time, you got to remember, this is before the INS, letters from citizens who say, I know Wong Kim Ark and he was born here. Affidavits signed by them, real people who live in San Francisco. The officer that takes him in, the customs officer, is John Wise, and he is an American, or you might say a nativist, anti-Chinese immigration. On the other hand, you have the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, or the Six Companies. And they find out that Wong's being held essentially captive on a ship in San Francisco Bay, and they file a writ of habeas corpus. Wong's being restrained in violation of his rights as a U.S. citizen. They cite the 14th Amendment and say, release him. And a district court agrees, because the district court simply reads the 14th Amendment, and in there it says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and the state wherein they reside. Okay, so the district court, reading that 14th Amendment, can find no way to interpret it that would exclude Wong Kim Ark. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. He made, at the most, a year-long visit to China. Then when he was 17, he made a couple months visit to China. In both instances, came back. He was born here on Sacramento Street in San Francisco. His parents were subjects of the Emperor of China, but he was born here. How else can you read it, the court says? Release him. Something happened since the time he was born in 1873 and 1882. We pass the Chinese Exclusion Act. Now, the Solicitor General looks at that law, and not so much the 14th, and says, Wong is barred entry under this act. Wong's not a U.S. citizen. His parents were Chinese persons. They were subjects to the Emperor of China. By extension, so is he. And the key phrase that he's relying on, anyone today going to argue it is going to rely on, is that subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That's problematic in a lot of ways, as we'll get into. And certainly the court would find that interpretation of Solicitor General Holmes Conrad problematic. Before we talk again about Wong Kim Ark, I want to also talk about something that's not talked about a lot in this discussion. When rarely you hear about Wong Kim Ark, and I think there'll be a lot of people talking about him now. By the way, spoiler alert, he gets into the United States. He has a decent laboring life. He actually has children. He has descendants here. California was sparsely populated, and yet it had so many resources. There was so much land, so much opportunity, that one day, California is going to be as big as the eastern states. There's so much opportunity here. Why not, come and participate? Make enough money to send it back to China or live there like a king, and all of those things. So there are a lot of people coming here, and it was a very tough life, though, for those that did. Not so easy as it seemed. Okay, but before we talk about Wong Kim Ark, I want to talk about something that people don't talk about, because there might be a sense that this decision was simply the court deciding in themselves. But no, there's definitely some precedent that they cite for how they interpret the concept of birthright citizenship. And one of those cases is called the Charming Betsey. No, it's not about a doll. It's not about a person. It's about a ship. The Charming Betsey is an American merchant vessel, and you got to follow the story, but it sails from Baltimore on April 1800, and it sails under the name of the Jane, and it sails for the island of St. Bartholomew with a cargo of flour, and then goes to St. Thomas, and then the ship is sold to a J.S., that's what they say in the court case, J.S., who was born in the United States. While an infant, he was removed to St. Thomas, of which place he became a burgher. Now, to me, that's a town, a resident of the town, right? And now let's look it up. How would the court define a burgher? Because that might be important. So that would be a name for like a well-heeled... that would be a name for a well-established resident of the town. And he carried on a trade as a merchant, married there. And in 1797, took on an oath of allegiance to Denmark. I believe Denmark owns St. Thomas. So J.S. put a cargo on board of the schooner, calling her the charming Betsey, and cleared her out for Guadeloupe. There, she's captured by a French privateer and ordered for Guadeloupe as a prize. Now, there's nothing the American Supreme Court can do about that. But she was then recaptured by the American frigate Constellation and carried into Martinique. The cargo is sold, and the vessel's brought now to the United States. The vessel and the cargo was considered as having violated the law of the United States prohibiting intercourse between the United States and France. And the sale to J.S., that's asserted to be just a cover to evade the law. Well, what they didn't count on is that J.S., in addition to taking that oath of allegiance to Denmark, was born in the United States. Now, the case is not directly on this, but this is what John Marshall, is saying. The American citizen who goes into a foreign country, although he owes a local and temporary allegiance to that country, yet if he performs no other act changing his condition, is entitled to the protection of his own government, and if, without the violation of any municipal law, he should be oppressed, he would have a right to claim that protection and the interposition of his government in his favor. All right, so there isn't a direct line between charming Betsey and Wong Kim Ark, except for an almost incidental line that Justice John Marshall makes. Whether a person born within the United States or becoming a citizen according to the established laws of the country can divest himself absolutely of that character otherwise than in such a manner as may be prescribed by law is a question which is not necessary at present to decide. So you'd think, like, if this is just a throwaway comment, like, I'm not deciding this issue, whether or not J.S., by taking allegiance to Denmark, gave up his allegiance to the United States. I'm choosing that that's way out of the scope of this decision, and I'm not deciding on it. Normally, right, you wouldn't think of a statement like that in a case as mattering much, but everything in a Supreme Court case matters when it's in the majority. So this is an important distinction, because let's read the first part of it again. Whether a person born within the United States or becoming a citizen according to the established laws of the country can divest himself absolutely of that character. What's Marshall saying? That the person has that character. How do they get that character? Marshall says there's two ways: born within the United States or becoming a citizen according to the established laws of the country. Now, it's not just me citing this decision and playing lawyer, it's the court in Wong Kim Ark citing Chief Justice Marshall. It appears to have been assumed by this court that all persons born in the United States were citizens of the United States. They also note that this is the same thing that happens in England. And the United States started as England, right? By the law of England for the last 3 centuries, beginning before the settlement of this country and continuing the present day, aliens, while residing in the dominions possessed by the Crown of England, were within the allegiance, the obedience, the faith or loyalty, the protection, the power, the jurisdiction of the English sovereign. And therefore every child born in England of alien parents was a natural-born subject, unless the child of ambassador or other diplomatic agent of a foreign state, or an alien enemy in hostile occupation of the place where the child was born. The same rule was enforced in all of the English colonies upon this continent, down to the time of the Declaration, and in the United States afterwards. And they say, continued to prevail under the Constitution as originally established. So Andrew Johnson is sent the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 by the Congress, and he doesn't agree with it. But in not agreeing with it, he gives a really clear understanding of what he doesn't agree with. And what is it? birthright citizenship. He's vetoing it because it provides birthright citizenship. Okay? So he is establishing that. Why do we care about the Civil Rights Bill of 1866? That's not the 14th Amendment. Well, it's authored by the same Congress that authored the Civil Rights Bill, and it has very similar language, including this, which is in Andrew Johnson's. This is Andrew Johnson vetoing the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. By the first section of the bill, all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, excluding Indians not taxed, are declared to be citizens of the United States. This provision comprehends the Chinese of the Pacific states, Indians, subject to taxation, the people called gypsies. Now that is a derogatory comment for Romani, as well as, he says, the entire race designated as blacks, persons of color, and uses some other words, persons of African blood. This is what Andrew Johnson cites. And unfortunately, these are undesirable people to him that he says this civil rights bill will be conferring citizenship on. Every individual of those races born in the United States is, by the bill, made a citizen of the United States. And they know exactly what they're doing when they write all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, with a slight change of subject to the jurisdiction thereof in the 14th Amendment. Wong Kim Ark decision. The court, Horace Gray is the key justice here, because when the Chief Justice dissents, as he did in this case, this will be a 6-2 decision. Horace Gray says, this was vetoed by the president with that explanation, and it was overridden by the Congress, understanding his objection, disagreeing with it, and making it the law of the land. Therefore, we know what the people at that time thought. The real object, Gray writes, of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution and qualifying the words, all person born in the United States by the addition and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, would appear to have been to exclude by the fewest and fittest words, besides children of members of the Indian tribes standing in a peculiar relation to the national government, unknown to the common law, the two classes of cases, children born of alien enemies in hostile occupation, and children of diplomatic representatives of a foreign state. Those had always been recognized exceptions to the fundamental rule of citizenship. So when the thing to understand about Wong Kim Ark is that they don't think they're changing laws, even back in 1899. So now I can say, and everyone's going to say in this discussion, this Supreme Court case goes back 125 years, and it absolutely does. But what I would add to that is they didn't think they were changing the law at that time. They didn't think they were overturning a thing at that time. They were merely interpreting what the 14th Amendment said, and indeed how common law had operated since the time of the colonies. You're born here, you're American. Unless there's these very narrow exceptions. One of the things the court does is get into legislative history as applying to law is controversial. There are a lot of people that say, you're never going to know what a Congress thinks when it votes. But nonetheless, in court cases, you do see it. And Wong Kim Ark, which is a very robust decision that takes in a lot, including a lot of the debates today, the kind of quick debates that people have today about this issue. I just suggest reading this decision and the dissent, because it's all kind of in there. You're either citing, depending on your point of view, Fuller's dissent or Gray's decision. For instance, they say, during the debates in the Senate upon the Civil Rights Bill, Mr. Trumbull, the chairman of the committee which reported the bill, moved to amend the first sentence as to read, all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States without distinction of color. Mr. Cohen of Pennsylvania asked whether it will not have the effect of naturalizing the children of Chinese and gypsies born in this country. Mr. Cohen doesn't sound like a fan of the bill. Mr. Trumbull answered, undoubtedly. Is not the child born in this country of German parents a citizen? Mr. Cohen replied, the children of German parents are citizens, but Germans are not Chinese. Mr. Trumbull rejoined, "The law makes no such distinction, and the child of an Asiatic is just as much a citizen as the child of a European." Mr. Reverdy Johnson suggested that the words "without distinction of color" should be omitted as unnecessary and said, "This amendment as it stands is that all persons born in the United States and not subject to a foreign power shall by virtue of birth be citizens." To that, I am willing to consent. And that comprehends all persons without any reference to race or color who may be so born. Do you understand where the court's getting at in citing this example? Not only are they saying we know what Congress thought when they passed the 14th because it's similar language to the Civil Rights, and that is the same Congress. We know what they meant by these words. We know what they meant to do. But also think about what the goal of the 14th of the Civil Rights Amendment is. If you're going to start making exceptions for various races or color, that's pretty far from that's exactly what they're trying not to do with the 14th. The reason the 14th Amendment is passed is because states had instituted laws that restricted the rights of African Americans here who recently had been enfranchised not enfranchised, I shouldn't say, but had recently been liberated after the Civil War. The last thing they're going to do is pass a law about color. And it's actually made clear right here in this decision. I mean, in fact, they use the example of Chinese. Mr. Cohen wants Chinese to be excluded. So this discussion happens. Mr. Conness of California replies, "The proposition before us relates simply in that respect to the children begotten of Chinese parents in California, and it is proposed to declare that they shall be citizens. We have declared that by law. Now it is proposed to incorporate the same provision in the fundamental instrument of the nation. I am in favor of doing so. I voted for the proposition to declare the children of all parentage, whatever, born in California, should be regarded and treated as citizens of the United States, entitled to equal civil rights with other citizens of the United States." By the way, his view in 1866, he's not going to get elected in California with that view in the 1880s. I mean, that's how much the politics change, and that's why this court case occurs. So let's get a little into Chief Justice Fuller. I don't want to just sit here and talk about Wong Kim Ark and beat you over the head with it, because I know there's a lot of dissenting opinion right now. So let's go with that original dissent from 1899 and see what 1898 actually. I cannot concur in the opinion. The proposition is that a child born in this country of parents who are not citizens of the United States under the laws of their own country and of the United States could not become such, as was the fact from the beginning of the government in respect to the class of aliens to which the parents in this instance belonged, is from the moment of his birth a citizen of the United States by virtue of the first clause of the 14th Amendment, any act of Congress to the contrary notwithstanding. The argument is that although the Constitution prior to that amendment nowhere attempted to define the words citizen of the United States and natural-born citizen as used therein, yet that it must be interpreted in the light of English common law rule, which made the place of birth the criterion of nationality, that the rule was in force in all the English colonies, that before the enactment of the Civil Rights Bill, all persons born in the sovereignty of the United States, whether children or citizens or foreigners, were native-born citizens of the United States. Thus, the 14th Amendment is held to be merely declaratory, except that it brings all persons, irrespective of color, within the scope of the alleged rule, and puts that rule beyond the control of the legislative power. If this conclusion is correct, then the children of citizens of the United States who have been born abroad since July 8th, 1868, when the amendment was declared ratified, were and are aliens, unless they have, or shall on attaining majority, become citizens by naturalization in the United States. He disagrees with some of the court's assertions. For instance, Fuller disagrees that this had been the case in England. He disagrees that this has been the case at the time of the history of America. No, it followed your father. You were who your father was. Your rights came from your father. Place of birth produces no change in the rule. The children follow the conditions of their fathers, for it is not naturally the place of birth that gives rights, but extraction. He also points out that, yeah, you're using common law, the law of England, but we abrogated that as a result of the Declaration and just accepted what we wanted. The states embraced in the Constitution. We became united under the same sovereign authority and governed by the same laws. But they retain their jurisdiction over all persons and things within their territorial limits, except where surrendered to the general government or restrained by the Constitution. He cites Justice Taney, who says, if you're going to use common law, you can in some small matters where it's clear that, the states adopted the principles of English jurisprudence, so far as it concerns private and individual rights. When such rights are in question, we habitually refer to English decisions. In many cases, that's authoritative. But in the distribution of political power between great departments of government, the U.S. government, there's such a wide difference between the power conferred on a president and the authority of the English crown that it would be altogether unsafe to reason from any supposed resemblance between them. And I'm not going to get into everything with the Fuller dissent, but essentially what he says is, how can the United States treat with the nation, as they've done with China, to limit the persons coming in and to place certain rules, and then decide, oh no, you don't have that power because of a right that's in the Constitution? Doesn't the United States have control over its territory? In Justice Fuller's decision, you really hear the modern viewpoint that's against birthright citizenship. There's no doubt about that. He cites another judge who says, if a stranger or traveler passing through or temporarily residing in this country who has himself not been naturalized and claims to owe no allegiance to us has a child born here, which goes out of the country with its father, such child is not a citizen of the United States. It was not subject to his jurisdiction. And he relies on this words, and not subject to any foreign power, and interprets it differently in the 1866 Civil Rights Bill, which again, both the dissent and the decision are using as an analog here. There is no necessity for the insertions of the words, unless there were others in respect of whom the exception was needed, namely the children of aliens, whose parents owed a local and temporary allegiance, merely remaining a subject to a foreign power by virtue of the tie of permanent allegiance, which they had not severed by formal abjuration or equivalent conduct, and some of whom were not permitted to do so if they would. 2 months after the statute was enacted, the 14th Amendment was proposed and declared ratified by July 28th. The first clause reads, all persons born or naturalized and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens. The act was passed, the amendment proposed by the same Congress, and it's not open to reasonable doubt that the words subject to the jurisdiction thereof in the amendment were used as synonymous with the words and not subject to any foreign power of the act. The jurist and statesman referred in the majority opinion, notably Senators Trumbull and Reverdy Johnson, concurred in that view, Trumbull saying, what do we mean by subject to the jurisdiction of the United States? Not owing allegiance to anybody else. That is what it means. Well then, the naturalization of the father carries with it that of his minor children, and his declaration of intention relieves them from the preliminary steps for naturalization, and minors are allowed to count part of the residence of their minority on the whole term required, and are relieved from the declaration of intention. What do we got here? Fuller's saying a lot. First of all, he's saying, if you go with this interpretation, then anyone born outside the U.S., let's say just somebody traveling, they're not American citizens. They have to go get naturalized. And they're not going to be too happy about that, Supreme Court. He's also raising the point that, let's say, a alien or foreign person can come here and declare their intention to become a citizen and go through that process. And then their children don't have to do that. But that's because they're minors. Here, we're reversing this and saying a child's automatically that. So, he's just pointing out some inconsistencies. But the other big issue he has is that, is one you hear today. Can't the United States control its territory? Why does this rule exists? Where does it come from? Why are we putting this on ourselves? To apply some of the descent of Fuller and Harlan to a 21-year-old who's coming back to this country, who was born here and lived most of his life here, versus a person who's quickly traveling through, like in the example that Fuller's giving, quickly traveling through, a foreigner has a baby and then goes back to their country, and now that baby's claiming birthright citizenship. And those are the problematic issues for today with this, which you're hearing in the discussion. But the right cannot be limited just by the case of Wong Kim Ark. You can't say if it doesn't fit his case exactly, then the ruling has no effect. No, Wong Kim Ark is the ruling that runs the land today. The end of this story is, as we said, Wong Kim Ark does win his case. He's released. He's allowed to go to San Francisco. He lives as a laborer. He's not a necessarily famous person, but he does show up in the papers again in 1901 in El Paso, Texas, because he goes back to China again. You would think after a guy had to go to the Supreme Court to get back into the United States, you wouldn't leave. But obviously he has his parents and his family in China, so he goes back again. And this time when he comes to the United States, he comes through Mexico. And at El Paso, he is detained once again, even after having this Supreme Court case named after him. But it's merely because they can't establish who he is, and once they do, he's led into the border. But that does make the El Paso newspaper, and they talk about Wong Kim Ark has been detained at the border. So a couple of things. What's the obvious thing? If you were not for this current decision that's been around since 1898 and is currently the law of the land, and Justice Horace Gray, who wrote the decision, would argue that it existed in law from the beginning of the Republic and even before. If you're born here, you're a citizen. If you don't agree with that, I know what you're thinking. You're going to go to the Supreme Court and get this decision overturned. And so to some extent, all the precedent of the Supreme Court has become something like tissue paper. I just had an argument recently where someone was saying, like, oh, well, it's not set in stone. It's just a decision from the Supreme Court. And I guess that's where we're at now, where things can just get overturned because there's no stare decisis. But it's certainly possible, given the makeup of the court, that everything could radically change. But there's a lot to think about when you're talking about court change. And through history, presidents we know have been disappointed by court appointees over time. It's usually over time. It usually doesn't happen like day one. Sometimes it does. I don't think, who was that guy? Van der Venter. I don't think Wilson ever liked him. And FDR was disappointed by Frankfurter. And, it goes on. George H.W. Bush disappointed by Souter. Souter, I should say. It just goes on and on. Of course, we've seen presidents disappointed because it's a lifetime appointment. Judges think differently from politicians. Judges think independently. But let's talk real here. We know that there's been a movement on, say, the Federalist Society and other groups to sort of package potential Supreme Court candidates so that this won't happen anymore. And that there's a particular group at the Supreme Court that will just overturn anything. And it's certainly possible that stare decisis doesn't exist anymore. That was thrown out with Chevron. That was thrown out with Hobbes. Okay, I hear that argument, and that's certainly possible. I'm not going to say that's out of the realm. That anything Trump wants to do, the court will rubber stamp it. That's not the way history's been, though, because you got to watch all the dimensions. When a president starts changing norms or doing things differently, new policies. You've seen that in history as the court changing to adjust to that. No, they wouldn't say they are changing. And you have justices like Souter, and you have justices like John Paul Stevens, who insisted that they were not changing, but that the approach of the executive branch or the legislative branch got more aggressive in a certain direction. And they didn't see the law. They didn't interpret the law that way. That was the same argument made by the so-called Four Horsemen of the court in the 1930s opposing New Deal legislation. But courts can change. People change. So sometimes that's it. And, you could have one of the current majority sort of shift their opinion. But you don't even need quite that. You just, again, I insist that their decisions on certain things might be different than their decisions on what a president who is already anticipating that the court has changed is going to start bringing before them. In effect, pushing the envelope, right? They might change their approach. The other thing is friction within the court. Just like any group, you've got a majority now. What happens? Infighting starts. They're usually a chummy group, the Supreme Court, but what's been shown in the past is that friction within members of the court can start to change legal reasoning. And majorities have to be kept whole. And there's, among a group of independent thinkers, that could be a tough thing to do. And you really need like a politician sort of judge like Earl Warren was, or a more craftsman like Blackmun was, and he could piece together 5 votes for a lot of things. Or somebody like a Lewis Powell is able to kind of compromise. Justices don't like to be told what to do. And so we'll see. We don't know the dynamics of what's going on within a court. So that's all of that is just to say you can anticipate what a court might do, but don't always assume it. I'll leave it there. www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.com. Please support me if you can. Thanks for listening.